Chapter 7. Unforgiveness in the Forgiveness Field. Willpower brought them to the edge of the woods, to what Katie would later describe as equivalent to her Katie's Cliff, if there ever were a place. The harmony of the rolling hills melding into each other in the distance made the most beautiful of patterns. The plush green fields of the new spring grass sang to Katie's eyes the most beautiful sonnet. She drew in a deep breath, absorbing the warm fresh air, saturated with fragrant wildflowers. Her chest dropped as she blew out that cleansing breath and leaned back against Nick's chest, forgetting the tension, and she laid her head back. He leaned his chin against her head, and without thinking wrapped his arms around her waist. "Beautiful, huh, princess? You see that stream way off in the distance?" he said, pointing toward the southern fields. "That's the river of remorse that feeds the penitent's pond. My gramps gave them all those names. I think it's the most beautiful place I've ever seen. The river of remorse, wow, that's cool." She wanted to relax and close her eyes, but the view was too beautiful to block out. She hadn't even noticed that Nick had his arms around her, because the view and the moment was too breathtaking for her to notice her surroundings. It was when he bent his head, and his lips touched the back of her neck, and without even thinking, as natural as it felt, the compulsion to kiss her caused him to draw his lips close, and he gently kissed that spot. She lurched forward and spun her head around with a look of shock and anger growing. "Oh, shoot, princess, I'm sorry." "Princess, nothing, get me off this beast, right now." Nick dismounted, discouraged and disappointed in himself. He put his hands up to assist her as she swung her leg over. "I got this," she said as she waved his arms away and hopped down, keeping her balance by bending her knees to absorb the shock of the landing. She quickly moved away from him, heading for the small pond off to the west of the field they were just facing. She walked briskly to the pond, taking her jacket off, and tying the arms of it around her waist. Her anger kept her warm. Nick led Willpower over toward the banks of the pond, where he satisfied his thirst before taking off to enjoy the sweet spring grass. "I'm sorry," Nick said several feet behind Katie. She turned and saw him as he was keeping his distance, then she turned back to the water. "It's not all your fault. Didn't help by letting my head rest against your chest like that, and maybe being a little too friendly." She turned her head and gave him a friendly, compassionate crooked smile, and that twinkle in her eyes that called to him drew him closer to her. "I'm sorry for being too quick to get angry with you again," she said, irritated with herself for being so quick-tempered, when she was just as much to blame if not more. She turned toward the water and got lost in the sparkling sun's reflecting beams off the rippled water. She took in the sweet smell of the fresh spring grass, and the musty mildew smell of the pond life. "It is magnificent here. Why, it's almost as wonderful as Katie's Cliff, maybe even better." She turned back toward Nick. He gave her a tilted nod, having enjoyed that view a few weeks back with Scotty, but afraid to mention it. "He told me he took you there. It's magnificent there, also. I loved that bench he built for you." "Yeah, it's great, isn't it? What a wonderful birthday gift it was. He's so thoughtful that way." "Oh, and the staying, complete with a police scanner, wasn't you being thoughtful?" She grinned, remembering that day and the look on Scotty's face. "He told you about that too? Geez, did he tell you my weight?" 107 pounds, at last weight check, I think he said, Nick said, chuckling. 108 3/4 now, she said, correcting him. "Good, keep it up, my good friend, because you look marvelous. I never want to see you that sickly again. You scared the shit out of us, all of us." He paused. She chuckled uncomfortably. "I can't believe I swore like that in your grand's kitchen. I was mortified." "Don't worry, princess, they thought it was funny. My gran may be a bit of a prude like your Matthew, but she can appreciate a cute little Yankee bell." They both chuckled. Katie turned back toward the water. "I imagine many of your most inspired moments came from this place." "Yep, Cindy's magic, Jolt Giver's touch, among many others," Nick said of his two songs, both nominated for Single of the Year in two different award ceremonies. Congrats on that, by the way. Geez, I was a bit worried. I was biting my nails. Oh, you mean you watched and wanted me to win then? No, I didn't want Cindy's Magic to win. I wanted it to lose, silly. Now, why on earth would you want that? Because I knew the more hits you put out the further away from Nicholas Paul you were, and the more Nick Thomas you became. He dropped his head in shame. But now, I'm singing a different tune, she said as she began to hum the tune to Jolt Giver's Touch. Oh, so you want that to win? Or do you still want me to lose? Sweetie, of course, I want it to win, because I'm here now, and if you ever revert back to Nick Thomas, the obnoxious superstar, well, I'll break both your kneecaps. I won't even wait for Scotty to help you find a new brick wall. She giggled. Gotcha, my fair lady. You got me shaking in my cowboy boots. Hell, I'm more afraid of you than any brick wall and the strong arm of your deputy. Trooper, he's a trooper, now. Oh, sorry, that's right. That's okay, just don't let him catch you giving him the wrong title. He's proud of his trooper's hat, and damn, he looks good in it. She immediately put her hand to her mouth. Oops, sorry. Nick shook his head. So, the guitar strap does nothing for you, huh? He cackled. No, silly, it's those damn dimples, she said as she pointed to his cheeks. He laughed, shook his head and walked away, mumbling to himself. Oh, and I hope another part, he said under his breath. What was that? She asked, having an idea of what he said. I said, you get right to my heart, when you say those things, sweetness. Yeah right, liar, and that other part, too, she said, giggling. They both laughed. You can't help it, it's your species. He snorted a laugh. Oh, and you women never have that problem, huh? He looked at her with his eyebrows going north and south in rapid succession, and she turned away from him again. Only with sexy cocky artists who won't back off, she said under her breath. I heard that, he said as he turned and walked over to the saddlebags hung on wool power. He pulled out a small wool blanket. He stepped forward a few steps toward Katie and laid down the blanket on the grass a few feet back from the banks of Penitence Pond. Katie looked back and saw him lay out the blanket. It was only large enough for two to sit on it. Here, if you want to sit. Katie backed up and sat on one side, leaving the other for him. Nick stood next to it, not wanting to take any more chances. She patted the spot next to her. You sure? What, can't two friends share a blanket to sit on? He smiled and sat. She pulled her knees in and hugged them, resting her chin on her knees. So, how many stones of, what did you call them? Stones of self-loathing, is what Gramps called them. Yeah, right, how many stones of self-loathing do you suppose are in there? Dozens, I imagine. So, where do you find these stones? Usually around the wooded area. He looked at her, reached in his back pocket, and pulled out the paper and a marker and the rubber bands and laid them on the blanket. She looked down at the paper and markers and turned to Nick, looking up, smiling. You come prepared, huh? Idea of what he said. Always. She looked at him and he gave her an affirming nod. She gave him a half smile, leaned on his shoulder as she stood with paper, rubber bands, and the marker in the other hand. Nick watched from the blanket as she started walking around with her head down, looking. She found two stones at the wood's edge. She squatted down to write on the papers and wrapped each paper-covered stone with rubber bands. She took a few more steps toward the pond, standing at its bank, closed her eyes, looked up to heaven, and tossed the stones one at a time out into the middle of the pond. Wow, you got some arm there, Nick said, coming up from behind to stand next to her. They looked at each other, smiled, and then returned to the blanket. 3 brothers. What? Nick asked. I grew up with 3 brothers, what you think I wouldn't have learned how to throw, and not like a girl? Nick chuckled. I was mercilessly taunted if I threw like a girl, so I learned the proper technique. She lowered her head and chuckled, shaking off the memories. Were they really that mean to you? Katie nodded, then shrugged her shoulders. I suppose there were nice moments. Unfortunately, it's the bad ones that stick out the worst. Isn't that always the case? Jimmy B was closest in age. He was 6 years older than me, and our older brothers picked on him when they weren't picking on me. He had one of those tender hearts, as a boy, you know? They used to call him Girly Boy, and he hated it. There were few and far between moments where we would have a kindred spirit, Jimmy B and me. Geez, he's about 42 now. I wonder if he got married. I know the other two did. Poor women, she mumbled under her breath. Nick turned and looked over at her. I imagine they'd been divorced and remarried a few times. They were just like my dad, couldn't stop roaming in search of new frontiers between the sheets. When was the last time you saw them? When our father died, I was about 22. He left all his money to me. I think it was a guilt offering. The boys hated me for that. I should have split it up, but Michael said no. He wanted to buy a house, and he said I deserved it for the hell they put me through. At the time, I handily agreed with him. And now? Katie shrugged her shoulders. I don't know. That was the only time Michael ever met my family, and he hated them, so it really doesn't matter now. He surely did love my Nana, though, and she him. She saw the injured little boy that lived inside of him. She had that way. People just loved her, and she loved people, Katie said, looking off over the pond in a daze as if seeing her Nana's face in the water's reflection. Like grandmother, like granddaughter. Katie didn't move, nor say anything, so Nick just let her bask in the wonderful memory of the only family member who made Katie feel loved. When she died, Katie paused to catch herself from crying. She paused. I swore I was going to be just like her. And I'll bet you have succeeded. Katie chuckled and shrugged her shoulders. Matthew says yes, she said with a quivering voice. I can't wait to go to heaven and see her. I'm looking forward to that day when I enter the pearly gates, and I hear that wonderful voice, Katie Lynn, welcome home. She called you Katie Lynn? Yep, the only one. She said it so fast, it was almost one syllable. KTLYNN. Oh, how I miss my Nana, she said with a broken voice. Nick put his arm gently around a mourning Katie, and she leaned into him. She knew how they treated me, so I'd go to her house as much as I could. They were glad to get rid of me. Marshfield, Massachusetts, my favorite place. Me and Jimmy B would go together when I was really young. She'd come for us in the summer for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. We'd wait forever. My Nana was never on time. It was agony waiting for her. She would take us shopping with her. We couldn't keep up with her, and we were just kids. She was always running about. Then there was the traditional trip to MCD's or the ice cream place. At night in the upper back bedroom, we'd supposed to be sleeping, but we would rest our chins on our hands on the windowsill and dream of better days to come. I simply adored that Marshfield house. My best memories are there, the only happy days of my childhood. She smiled as if she were back there. Nick just watched her, and the joy that changed the morning into happy memories. Nana's house was high up on a hill and there were neighborhoods below. We'd stare into the twinkling of their porch lights. Beyond that was the downtown area, and you could see all those lights. Even further beyond was the ocean. Sometimes, there'd be boats out on the water and you could see those lights. We'd stay there for hours, talking about our dreams we wished would come true. Mine was to own Nana's house as an adult and raise my children there. What I wouldn't do to get back up into that back bedroom. Her eyes watered with want. Sounds wonderful. A peaceful place, huh? It was a place where I knew I was loved beyond a shadow of a doubt. She never yelled at me or got mad at me. Oh, there was that time when she caught me with matches because I smoked, and the time I stole a pack of gum from the store when I was real little. They were the only 2 times she scared me. She wasn't terribly affectionate or verbally expressive on how she felt about people. You only knew by her behavior and how many people she helped. She rubbed my back with her calloused hands at night. She'd hum while I fell asleep. My Nana sure did love me. It's too bad you didn't get that at home. I think I got enough to make up for it at those visits at Nana's. During the days, she would take us to the beach. We'd walk down the end of the dead-end road, through a pathway in the woods. There was a clearing there and there was this giant rock. She would stop us there and make us change our shoes. She'd put my sandals on, because right after that would be dirt roads, then the beach parking lot to Brant Rock Beach. I loved that place. That's where you had a lot of you beach parties, right? Isn't that where the culmination to rescue Fair Maiden from Stalker happened? Katie turned to Nick, with a single tear running down her cheek. He caught it with his finger, and she smiled. A brain like a tortoise, but a memory like an elephant. How do you do that? He shook his head at her dig. Do what? He asked. Remember all those little details. Princess, it was like I lived them all over again when I was in the hospital. I swear the dreams I had while I was out like a light were so vivid, and they brought back so many good memories it felt like I was back in that booth, and on that beach with you. I'll bet it sucked waking up to my angry stare. You weren't angry when I first woke, it was later when you figured I was going to be okay, that you let me have it. She shook her head. Guilt began to weigh heavy on Katie, so much so, Nick could see it in her face. Sweetness, we've been through this, and you threw your stones in the pond, so they sit at the bottom, and they'll stay there, never to be seen again. She turned, but the guilty look did not leave her face. She stood and walked over to the pond. She had thrown 2 stones, and he did not know what either was for, and this was something she was going to have to confess now. 2 stones, she said as she faced the pond. He heard her say something, but did not know what, and he rose to meet her. He stood behind her, making sure not to put his hands on her. He put them in his pockets, locked his elbows, raised his shoulders and leaned on his hands, to keep them from floating naturally to her shoulders, like they did so many times that night. What did you say, princess? 2 stones, she repeated, then turned to look up at him. 2 stones what? He had a curious look on his face. She took in a deep breath of the forgiveness field's air, held it, and then walked back over to the blanket. He followed and sat down next to her. She pulled up her knees, and hugged them, while he looked down, thinking there was something else that weighed heavy on her heart. I was so very wrong to be that mean, especially to an injured man. I deserved it. Not as much as you think, she said in a sigh. What's that supposed to mean? I was not without sin in all that mess, she said as she crooked her head towards him. Truth be told, I am actually the one to be blamed for the whole fiasco, when it comes right down to it. This was a preposterous notion, he thought. If you mean the fight at the Cheapside and you taking the blame, we've already discussed that. I was the drunken fool who picked the fight. It doesn't matter if you wanted Scotty to take me out to the woodshed, he would have been right in doing so. She shook her head, and looked straight out into the pond, almost afraid to face him. No, I'm not talking about that night, I'm talking about the entire mess, from the very beginning. How? I'm the one who became the drunk, obnoxious egomaniac, and said all those awful things about you. I became that big stupid star you said I would become, worshipping my own press. I was hateful and mean to you. I can't imagine how that must have felt from your perspective. I mean, I swore my undying love to you, then a year later I'm spewing hate towards you. What were you thinking? I think if things were opposite, I know that I would have been crushed. But you said those things, because I was some obscure obnoxious author, you didn't know it was me. You said that you weren't paying attention to anyone. Didn't you say that you even avoided looking at pictures of me? Nick nodded. yes, because I was a big shot. The only time your name was allowed in my presence was if it was derogatory, like Brooke and her friends would say. When did the first hurt begin? When I didn't show up in August? Nick took in the memory of that very first crushing day. He looked out into the penitent's pond, watching the rippling of the water, and thought about the rippling pain that increased day after day without his jolt giver. Yes, my heart sank. I had made it to August. I never thought it would take that long. I mean, you said you were good at picking people up, and you'd have that deputy back up on his feet in no time, so I guess I assumed a couple of months at best, 3 or 4 at worst. I never thought it would go as long as August. Then when I got word that you requested the tickets and backstage passes, my heart leapt out of my chest. I wore it on my sleeve for the next few weeks, driving my guys nuts. They said I was impossible to live with. I was so anxious, I just thought that day would never come. I thought it was going to be the beginning of you and me. She dropped her head and shook it. She pulled up her knees into a hug and laid her head down on them. She crooked her head up toward him in empathy, and the tears in her eyes told him how much she hurt for him, even now. Wow, you must have been crushed when you saw Becca and not me. He looked down at her with the saddest eyes, and she returned guilt-ridden eyes. He nodded. Yes, I was, but Becca explained why you weren't ready, and I understood. Every day, I relived that night in my mind over and over, not wanting to forget any of the details. Every day the pain got worse. Your drinking was you trying to drown your hurt, right? Nick shook his head. That was part of it, I think. When those first 2 songs went #1 in record time, all of a sudden life seemed to spin out of control. I had no clue how the public's demands would run my life. The pressure to keep the momentum going was crushing, oppressing even. It took all the fun out of the craft, and the love, just like you said. I'd get to the top and work my ass off to stay there. I soon found out that keeping a massive following of fans happy made me lonelier than ever. I had no one to share it with, no one to come home to, no one to answer to. The more people that came into my life, the less real friends I had. I saw such cutthroat attitudes there. Some didn't care how the hell they got there, or who'd they have to marry, he said, referring to Chelsea. It wasn't what you thought it was going to be, right? I think I could have made it better, but the drinking is what muddied the waters and just made it all go bad from there. Did you start drinking because you just liked to party, or could it be that you felt I abandoned you? I think it was a little of both. I started partying more, and when I was drunk, I noticed my heart didn't ache as much. So, I just made it a habit until it got out of control. The more I drank, the more trouble I got into, the guiltier I felt, the more I drank to drown the guilt. It was stupid. I just couldn't face the guilt and stop it. Did you try to forget about me? You know, with the way everything changed, and how I changed, there were times when I thought about you, and it seemed like it was a different time and space, like that world just didn't exist anymore. Eventually, I buried Nicholas Paul, because he was vulnerable and got hurt, so I became toughened and refused to love anybody, including myself. I didn't respect anyone. I hated myself, and yet I loved myself, or the big shot of myself. I screwed everyone. I yelled at my crew all the time. I didn't care about anyone but myself and my hurt. My Gramps and Gran, and Sean and all my family kept trying to tell me how much I had changed, but to me, I was just letting off steam. Gramps kept telling me to clean it up, but you weren't in my life, and I thought, if she does come back, I'll clean it up, but if she's not coming back, there's no use in it. You told me that if there was even a hint of impropriety on my part, you were going to put a wedding ring on that finger. I assumed after the Chelsea thing, and then my partying, that maybe you had, and I had lost you. My life was full of despair, because I had lost my one true jolt giver. You assumed after the Chelsea thing that I married Scotty? Yeah, it was either that or the party boy reputation, and well, I did what you said I'd do. I started playing the groupies, especially when I was really drunk. I lost my faith in you coming back, and then I lost my faith in myself. Katie lowered her head and began to cry with remorse for her part in Nick's hurt. Nick pulled her into him. Why are you crying, sweetness? Oh, Nicholas Paul, you aren't to blame for all that happened to you, I am. Don't you see? Everything you went through, all your hurt, your hopelessness, your loss of your moral compass. All that was my fault. I turned you into that person with the hurt. I promised you I'd come back, and I didn't. You had good reasons. She shook her head. I made a mess of my life, and you didn't want to be in that mess. I understand. After the Chelsea thing, it just spiraled after that. It's not your fault, and I won't let you take any responsibility for that. It's all on me, sweetness. No matter how much he confessed as part of it, he could not wipe the guilty look off her face. What is it, princess? Nicholas Paul, it was all my fault. She swallowed hard and pulled in her lips. I've been holding this in for such a long time, these few weeks. Stupid me kept feeding my warrantless anger. I had no right to be angry, it's the other way around. Teach, I don't understand. Katie took in a deep breath and let out a long sigh. It was confession time, and this was what she feared and dreaded. When he knew the truth, she assumed that he would lose all respect for her, and well he should have, in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Nicholas Paul, she said as she sat up on her knees and faced him. You have to know this, it wasn't your fault, it was mine. I kept accusing you of not wanting me after that night, and it was me who rejected you. I could have come back to you before August. I kept trying to talk myself out of it, then into it, then out of it, again. I had a flight scheduled from Massachusetts the week before the concert. I had every intention of coming. Then, I backed out at the last minute. Why? Nick asked. Katie turned her body away from him and folded up her knees Indian style. It was time for her to be honest and hope for the best. Teach, why didn't you come back? Becca said that you were working on a project, now I assume that to be your book. She shook her head. She told me that you weren't ready, or that Scotty wasn't completely ready, or something like that. She led me to believe it would be shortly after that. Katie nodded. That was Becca's optimism. I had made up my mind not to come back. But your note. It said you wanted to be with me, that you'd be with me soon, that I should turn to Gramps for encouragement. I was stringing you along, because I didn't have the courage to tell you the truth? What truth? What do you mean by stringing me along? Why would you do that? Cowardly fear, Nicholas Paul. I don't understand, what are you talking about? He turned his body to face her, but shame and guilt weighed too heavily on her head to let her raise it and look at him, especially in his eyes where all his pain remained, the pain she caused. Fear at first, then I was a coward. He lifted her head with his index finger under her chin. Princess, I'm not following you. She shook her head and began true repentant weeping. All the weeks of anger now turned into weeks worth of guilt, because the truth was hitting her like a brick wall, concussing her heart. She tried to speak, but the sobs kept her from being able to say the words he needed to hear. Sweetness, what has you so tied up in knots? He asked as he put his hands on her shoulders. She gathered herself and worked up the courage to talk about her paralyzing fear. You spent so much time trying to convince me not to fear happiness, and that night I didn't, but the monster of fear did not die. It just lay dormant for a while. Then enough time away from you, and it grew back and consumed me. I still couldn't fully trust God. I kept reliving the night Michael died in my mind. I couldn't go through that again. I was so afraid of it. I started rationalizing reasons why we just wouldn't be good together. I had a laundry list, for crying out loud. I even wrote them all down and put them on my bureau to look at every day, so as to ingrain them in my heart. I can understand that fear, Teach, with all you had been through. She shook her head. What? Don't you see, I was such a hypocrite. My book was finished long before August. Here I was writing a book of hope, yet not having any of my own. I almost didn't even believe my own words, until I realized that they weren't my words, they were God's. He was giving me the words to give others hope. I assumed those words were for other people, yet, he was trying to give me hope, through those words, but I still denied it to myself. That was when I chose not to come in August. I wrote that note, because I was too much of a coward to tell you that I had decided not to come back to you. Then the next thing I knew, you were so busy touring with your new album and turning out hit after hit. You then started that big tour with Chelsea. Your audiences were getting larger and larger with each month. Your fan following exploded. I watched you from a distance on your way to superstardom, like Tony had predicted. I told myself that you were too big for me. I talked myself into believing that a big superstar with that many followers surely isn't going to want me, boring me, anymore. I talked myself into believing that you would find someone else and be happier, another starlet. And then the Chelsea rumors fed into that fear, I'll bet. I understand that. She nodded. I think I believed you when you denied them, but I talked myself into giving her just that little bit of shadow of a doubt. I gave her the shadow. I knew that, because it was out there, you wouldn't expect me back. Then I talked myself into believing that she was better for you, anyway. Why? Because she was a beautiful superstar, your own kind. She is way more beautiful and charismatic than I am. I am just a boring kindergarten teacher. I mean seriously, what guy would want a plain Jane teacher when they could have a beautiful, gorgeous, hot superstar for his girlfriend? That's just how the world works, Nicholas Paul. Nick shook his head. How many times do I have to tell you that you are not plain Jane? She shrugged her shoulders. That's what I see in the mirror. Well, you are the one who needs her eyes checked, then. Your beauty inside makes your beauty outside even that much more radiant. It's like Kathy said. It doesn't matter how beautiful a woman looks on the outside if she's a bitch on the inside, she's ugly all over. Chelsea is a bona fide bitch. She's only using Colton to get to the Country Hall of Fame. He's her ticket to country star legendary status. She as much as admitted that to me. She had this thing for me, yeah, but being a legend was more important to her. A couple of times, she'd say, you know, I'd rather be with you, we can go to the top together and become legends. She wanted both me and legendary status. When I didn't want her, well, she opted to stay with Colton, which was fine with me. Katie shook her head. Did Colton know this? I think he had an idea, that's why he started the rumors, he was testing her loyalty to him. She loved that, she figured eventually, I'd give in to the rumors and her, especially the longer you stayed away. You told her about me? Nick nodded. Yeah, I talked about you to everyone, all the time. I told everyone that I was waiting for you. Of course, I didn't say who you were. She was so jealous of someone, and she didn't even know who. I think she figured she'd let the rumor simmer and that would keep you away. Katie turned up one side of her mouth. Well, that worked. I was too afraid of falling back in love with you, only to be rejected. I wouldn't have rejected you. Maybe you wouldn't at first, but then, after a while. Not even after a while. I can't believe you didn't trust me. Listen, it wasn't just you, Nicholas Paul. Like I said, there was the fear factor of you dying, then the fear factor of your friends rejecting me, because I wasn't beautiful like Chelsea. Why don't you believe me about how beautiful you are? Because, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Nick nodded. Well, I figured that even if you were delusional and couldn't see straight, I could, and I figured your celebrity friends could too. Eventually, you'd hear the jokes they'd make about the hunky singer with the ugly chick, and they'd tease you. I figured you'd start to see me that way and want out, but feel trapped, because you made a promise, and you were a promise keeper. I didn't want to put you in that kind of trap. Nick dropped his head and held his forehead with his hand. He shook his head. Yeah, but being a legend was more important to her. A couple of times, she'd say, you know, I'd rather be with you, we can go to the top together and become legends. She wanted both me and legendary status. When I didn't want her, well, she opted to stay with Colton, which was fine with me. Katie shook her head. Damn it, Teach, that's ridiculous. Sean says you're beautiful, everyone in my family thinks you are, Scotty does, for crying out loud the whole world does, why can't you believe that? She shrugged her shoulders. When you smile, you light up a room, don't you know that? She shook her head. Well, when fear paralyzes someone, they start to believe anything and everything they tell themselves, no matter how ridiculous it sounds to anyone else. When you started being flanked with all those beautiful women, and the Chelsea thing, I just used that as fuel for my theory. Then the press caught up with you as a playboy. So, I told myself that I saw it coming, and I knew you would end up like that. I just went with pessimism. I always have. You know, originally, I didn't want to invite you to my book release party, but Jay and Matthew insisted that I did. After all, you inspired the book. They thought once we were in the same place, the sparks would fly, and my fear would dissipate. But I still feared the glass bottom. I still do. I don't know how else to be. I just can't feel any other way. So, when you started tweeting those awful things, well, that was it. I was definitely off the hook, because you turned on me and hated me. It was my excuse to just forget the whole thing. Nick sat there and tried to digest all that she said. On the one hand, he understood the fear, on the other hand, he thought about how she strung him along. He wasn't sure whether to be angry, or just feel so sorry for her because of the demon of fear. As good as I am at talking other people into hope, fear talks me into not hoping for myself. I choose to not let myself want anything or anyone. I choose to live a life of living in despair. Because despair can't disappoint you, and it never runs out on you. It doesn't deflate, and it has no glass bottom. Teach, I hate that you have this fear and that you let it rule you. I'm hurt that you weren't honest with me, yeah, that was wrong, but I still said all those awful things about you. You must have thought by then that I hated you. You didn't know that I didn't recognize Katie Lynn Moore as my Teach, my cat. So, you thought I was aiming those insults directly at you, after I professed all my love to you a year earlier. I can understand your feeling betrayed, and that just burned the fear in deeper. She shook her head and pulled in her lips. What? Actually, that's not exactly true. Oh, boy, this is hard. I knew, well, deep down I figured as much. Shortly after the book release party thing, Matthew suggested that it was possible that you didn't know it was me, because I lost some weight. I looked different, and you only saw me with the pink hat on. He reminded me that I didn't recognize him as Michael's twin brother 2 years after I met Michael, because the memory can sometimes mix things up. He wasn't happy about the way you were living, and he thought that I should have gotten in contact with you and see if that was the case. I knew that I gave you only my given name, Catherine Lynn Peterson, but no one else knew that. Geez, even the Family Heralder brought that up once, hoping that was why you were saying those things. She was spot on, she always is. That one and I have a connection, I tell you. I adore her heart. Katie gave him a look. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. I gave you that name when we first met because I didn't trust you, and I couldn't lie in front of the girls. Okay, I get that, then you told me Peterson, because you didn't want me to look you up, right? Yes, and no. I gave you that name, because that tiny bit of fear that lived in me snuck through. I gave you just Peterson and didn't tell you about Katie when we talked about nicknames. I figured it was my out if I got spooked, again. You know, I had a Facebook account then, under the name Katie Moore. I needed to have the control over whether we got back together or not. Matthew and Becca kept pushing me to contact you, all that time. I thought you said Matthew won every time. She nodded. That was the first time he didn't. You see, they didn't know that I didn't give you my correct name. I kept that little bit of information from them. I let them think you were aiming those jabs at me, even if I questioned whether you knew it was me or not. Well, you picked an awful disagreement to stand your ground. Gee, Teach, why couldn't you have picked something a little less paramount? So, all that time, he kept pushing you to call me? Yes, but this whole book thing caught me by surprise and went spiraling out of control. I didn't know if I was coming or going. Then, well, I lost so much weight, I knew for sure I didn't look the same. I saw an ugly waif, and figured there was no way you'd want me. Then the nightmares began. What nightmares? I saw myself approaching you at a pub with all those beautiful women around you. When you saw me as awful as I looked, you started making fun of me in front of them. Look ladies, there is my plain Jane teacher. You know, I once thought I was in love with her, but that was when I was a nobody. Can you believe I once wanted that thing? Then the echoes of you all laughing at me got so loud it made my ears hurt. I was screaming and bawling, and so embarrassed, humiliated in that dream. Then I'd wake up and cry. That's crazy, I would never have done that. I looked for you in every face, in every city. Every time we went anywhere near Indianapolis, Louisville, or any place in Kentucky. I'd walk the streets and look for your face. When we were at Rupp, I searched and searched for you, hoping I'd bump into you. I kept hoping that Juliana would drag you to a concert. I promised you that I wouldn't look you up, but I did anyway. I kept searching for you. But I searched for Catherine Peterson and every variation of that. I know, when I met your Gran and Gramps, they told me how much you missed me and wanted me back, even as late as then. They nearly begged me to call you. They said if anybody could have brought back their Nicholas Paul, it would be me. They wanted me to rescue you. Did you believe them? Katie nodded. They were so concerned about your drinking. I thought maybe that's why they wanted me to get in touch with you. They feared that you would end up like your father. Then I had a new reason for not contacting you, a new fear, alcoholism. I thought, well, I already tried to rescue one man with an addiction, and I lost that battle. I didn't want to go down that road again. So, there was the fooling around rumors, my ugliness, my fear of your substance abuse, and of course, the twit and all she was writing. She was lying, she made it seem like there was something between us, and there never was. Was she lying, though? In the beginning yes, but then, I guess the more I drank the more reasons I gave her to believe she could win me over, in her delusions, even though in my head, it would never happen. You gotta admit, she's gorgeous, though. Nick shook his head at Katie's fear of beautiful women. Then I birthed a new reason why I shouldn't contact you. What was that? I was so busy doing good, saving children and helping people, and you were party boy, living just for yourself. You were a self-serving artist, and I was this righteous, self-sacrificing philanthropist. I told myself I was better than you, more upstanding. I made any and every excuse to keep myself away from you. So, fear kept you away, all of those reasons were because of fear. Fear of my dying, fear of my cheating, or wanting out, or substance abuse, or rejecting you. Katie nodded. How could he be mad at that? Teach, as much as I hate that, I understand it. I can't be mad at you for that. That still doesn't make it your fault. Yes, you see, if I had just called you those few months later, right after I finished the book, none of this would have happened, but I just talked myself into thinking a cop and a schoolteacher went better than a country artist and a schoolteacher. So, you decided to stick with Scotty? She shrugged her shoulders. I think I decided to keep him around, to see if I could ever be happy with him. After a while, I knew I couldn't. I hated my life, and I stopped eating, because I didn't want to live anymore. It just seemed to me, what was the use if it was going to be sadness, mourning, and glass bottoms breaking? Then it took over. The anorexia? She nodded. That still doesn't make it your fault. Look, Nicholas Paul, I'm a coward. I knew I was partly if not all to blame, but who took the fall? Nick looked off into the distance. You sat there on that sidewalk, crying, devastated, begging for my forgiveness, telling me how sorry you were, and Matthew kept telling me that unrequited love does those kinds of things to people. He still didn't know that I gave you a different name, but I knew. I let you take the blame for all that animosity between us, and I knew all along it wasn't me you hated. Matthew said I broke my promise to you, before you broke yours, yet I let you take all the blame, and I kicked you when you were down. You may have forgiven me in your car last night, but that was under false pretenses. Nick turned to look at Katie and thought about all that she said and how devastated and ashamed he felt. Yet, she laid it all on him, knowing in her mind, she had a large part in the broken relationship and his broken heart. She broke his heart long before he broke hers. He rose and walked over to the pond to contemplate the shock of this revelation. She walked up behind him a few steps and stayed back, while he digested all that she told him. Then those words rang in his head and stung his heart. You may have been drunk when you spread yourself around, but I was stone cold sober when I made love to Scotty and became one with him. Oh, and for your information, when I made love to him at the hospital, it was the best sex we've ever had. Thanks for that idea about having the nurses put a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. It worked splendidly. All that time, he assumed she was just being mean to strike back, but was it true? She walked up to him and got close. His face was somber. Teach, please tell me that when you told me that you made love to Scotty, it was a lie to get back at me, that you were just bluffing. Katie's facial expression became even more darkened and guilt-ridden. She pursed her lips, and her saddened eyes and eyebrows gave him the worst answer he could have possibly heard. It was true. She made love to Scotty to get back at him, and in the hospital, using his idea and plan, just to spite him. She was acting all mad at him for sleeping with groupies, while he was drunk, and she did it with Scotty, sober, and after they were reunited. She was acting like he was immoral for sleeping around, yet she did it too, with Scotty, to get back at him. So, you mean to tell me that you were 2 floors up, having sex with Scotty, to get even with me, using my tactic? Right there, right then? She nodded slowly with sad eyes. Was there a second time like you boasted? She nodded. When? It was 2 weeks later. He came home from work so upset because a Kentucky state trooper had been killed in the line of duty that day. I was so scared, because for a couple of hours, I didn't know if it was him or not. They would not release the name. I couldn't get in touch with him. We were both so upset. He asked me if he could make love to me. He needed me to comfort him, and I needed his comfort, having been spooked like that. We were both so traumatized. Nick looked at Katie with self-righteous indignation, fury, jealousy, and then with a devastation in his mind swirling around screaming at him to strike back. Their being traumatized over something like that, his needing comfort certainly, to Nick, was no excuse for going to bed with Scotty, especially after she knew that he was back and he proved that he still loved her. He told her that he never stopped loving her. He walked away from her, closer to the pond. She started making steps toward him. He turned toward her, and it was his turn to start a war with his words like she did at the bar. All that hostility, all the guilt and blame I carried, yet you acted like you were so innocent, the poor victim. I took it all, thinking I hurt you, when it was you striking back at me all this time. She moved closer toward him with shame dripping from her eyes in every tear. As she came closer, he put his hand up. Don't come near me. Don't touch me. You did this. You dumped me, lied to me, strung me along, made up stupid excuse after stupid excuse, and let me self-destruct from my broken heart. You knew that I didn't put the author and you together as the same person. You knew that. You pretended that I slandered you, my teach, you let me believe you didn't know that I didn't know. Then you let me shoulder all the blame, and you slept with Scotty for revenge against me. He was breathing fury out of his nostrils. He was angry enough to want to get as far away from her as possible. He even contemplated leaving her out in that field by herself. He walked away from the pond and got on Willpower and rode him fast and furious out into the meadow. His anger drove that horse, running him faster than he had probably run in a long time. She watched him far off as he dismounted and hit the ground. She kept holding her breath, afraid that he would leave her there in that field, but worse, leave her heart there and never go back for it. Willpower stuck close to his friend, nudging him with his nose as Nick pushed him away. Katie turned toward the pond and then sat for a long time before she heard the hooves of Willpower. She turned and saw that Nick's face was blank, void of any love for her. "Let's go," he said with a coolness and distance in his command. Katie put her hand in his, as he pulled her up on the saddle with him. This time there was a brick wall of coldness between them. His body was stiff and rigid, and there was no jolt nor shiver. She feared saying anything to him, and they rode back in silence. When they reached the barn, Nick did not even attempt to help her down. Katie dismounted just like she did in the forgiveness field. Nick led Willpower back into his stall. He took off the saddle and placed it on the saddle rack. He removed the blanket and started vigorously brushing down Willpower. Katie stood there and watched Nick take out his anguish with a horsebrush on the mane of his best friend. Her eyes were glued onto him, but his eyes saw her face as if it was a polar opposite magnet, pushing him away by force. It was as if she wasn't in the barn, on the farm, in the world at all. Willpower moved toward Katie and nuzzled her, sensing the rough brushing Nick was doing to him. Nick pulled him back. "Stop that nonsense, now get back here so I can brush you down." Katie turned and left the barn, without a word spoken. She walked into the back door of the kitchen. It was empty, and she went into the living room. Again it was empty. The house was empty, as was her heart. Gramps and Gran's Jeep Cherokee was gone, and she sat in that living room feeling so alone and so unloved. She sat on the living room sofa with her head down and tears streaming down her face. When Nick came into the living room, he saw her tears, but then walked right by her, out the front door, and without even acknowledging her pain or presence. She went up to the guest room and laid on her bed in fetal position and cried herself to sleep. She woke about an hour later when she heard Gran and Gramps coming in the front door. When she went downstairs, they were bringing in grocery bundles. Gran looked up at her and smiled. "Hello, Kate, dear, looks like we are having company tonight. My daughter and my granddaughter are coming for supper. I think they want to meet our Nicky's girl." Gramps nudged Gran. "Oh, sorry. I got a little ahead of myself. Sean and Kathy are coming, she's probably your biggest fan. I'm not sure if Nicky's coming. I haven't been able to reach him." "I don't have fans, Gran," Katie said coolly. "And right now, Nicholas Paul is the least of them," she added. "What happened, dear? Did you get into a fight or something?" Katie followed Gran into the kitchen after grabbing a sack from her. Gran and Gramps started putting away the groceries as Katie emptied the bags. "He found out something that I told him was the truth, and he didn't like it very much." "Oh, dear. Jacob?" "I'm on it." Jacob left the kitchen through the back door. Katie watched. "Where's he going?" "Probably to call Nicky. Jacob has a way with that boy. He can calm him down from anything." Katie walked over to Gran and put her hand on Gran's arm. "I'm not so sure this time. He wouldn't even look at me, nor speak a word to me." "My goodness, it must have been bad." Katie nodded. "Sweetheart, Nicky loves you. You do know that. He'll be back." Jacob returned into the kitchen shaking his head, not able to reach Nick on the phone. Katie turned toward Jacob. "Oh, my goodness, he must be so mad at me. What should I do?" "Nothing, just wait it out. That boy loves you. He'll recover from this." Gran gave her a hug as she tried to comfort her. "I know my grandson. He'll be here soon, if not today, tomorrow." Give him some space, Gramps told her. Katie looked at them both, as they tried to reassure her that he indeed would get over it. She ascended the stairs as tears fell down her cheek. She needed to freshen up before dinner and before she was to meet the rest of Nick's family. About 15 minutes later, she came into the kitchen with her phone in hand. Are you trying to call my Nicky? The thought had never even occurred to Katie. Actually, I've been trying to reach Scotty, Becca, and Matthew, and no one is picking up, since this morning. I find that so odd. I've never had all three not pick up. Scotty was supposed to have his tests done early today, and I wanted to know how he was. I'm kind of worried. Now, don't you worry, I'm sure he's fine. One of them will call you. Have you tried to call my Nicky? Gran, I don't even have his number. Emma Grace chuckled. She got a piece of paper and wrote down Nick's number. You think I should? It can't hurt. If Nicky doesn't recognize the number, he usually lets the voicemail pick it up. Leave a message. I'm sure he'll be glad you called. Katie took the paper and walked into the living room and then out the front of the house onto the front porch. She dialed the number, and like Gran said, she reached only his voicemail. Nick, it's me, Katie, Teach. I'm so sorry I hurt you so much. I'm asking you to forgive me. My heart is broken over what I did. Seeing your reaction, your eyes so dark and dull. I felt nothing but pure contempt from you. Now I know how you felt when I was the jerk I was a few weeks back. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm worried about you, so are your Gran and Gramps. If you don't want to call me, please just call one of them. Let them know you are okay. Chapter 8. Reckoning with his fate and living out faith. While